at this juncture, I cannot imagine a topic that is more relevant to this forum than the topic of shale gas and the extraction of natural gas from shale formation. I would like to acknowledge the presence of some of our leaders. We have the Senior VP for Research, Dr. Don Sebastian. See him there. Thank you. And we have to also thank Dr. Jay Kapraf from the Math Department that is managing this forum for years. Let's give him a hand of applause. And with that in mind, I would like now to introduce our speakers. We have 3 speakers for today. Each one will speak for 15 minutes. So I would like to ask you to hold your questions. Actually, don't hold them. You can write them down on the 3x5 where Dr. Kapraf has them. So any moment you like to ask a question, you could just raise your hand and someone will pass the paper to you. Maybe Mr. Leo, you could help on that. So we have 3 speakers, each one for 15 minutes, and then there will be Q&A. You will ask the questions, but also the panelists might have some discussions. Now, without further ado, then, I would introduce the first speaker is Dan Soder. I'm going to present them the way they are list them the way they are presenting. Dan Soder is a geologist in the Department of Energy. He graduated, he got his bachelor degree from Cleveland State University and his master's from Bowling Green in geology. He worked for the United States Geologic Survey for about 18 years, and then another stint, 5 years with the Department of Energy. So you could tell approximately his age. You're almost 30, isn't it? From the other side. So that's still almost. And he was one of the few people actually who paid attention to the topic of shale gas, and he has a paper published in 1988, long before anyone knew about the shale gas issue, where he pointed out the possibilities and the challenges. And our next speaker following him will be Fred Baldassari, who is a geologist, has master's in geology from University of Pittsburgh. His bachelor in geology was from Penn State University. And he worked for the Pennsylvania Department of Protection for about, I think, 20 years. And currently he has his own firm and he's consulting. His area of expertise is the movement of gas in aquifers. And last but not least is Tracy Caluccio, which I served with her on panels in the past, but in this particular case, I would like to follow the biography. She's the deputy director of the Delaware River Keepers, which is a nonprofit organization working for both protection and restoration of the Delaware Basin. She is the lead staff person from that organization dealing with the issue of shale gas. And she has numerous articles on the topic. The most recent one was in 2010, where she developed, she talked about the next generation for energy usage. And without further ado now, I'm going to invite the first speaker, Dan Soder.
Okay, thank you, Dr. Boufadel. I stepped out of the room earlier to make a phone call. When I came back, I found out I was first speaker, so it serves me right. I'm going to talk to you this morning or this afternoon for a few minutes about environmental risk assessment for shale gas development. And this is what the program has evolved into at the Department of Energy. But I want to give you a little bit of background as to how we got to where we are, and then give you a sense of where we think we're going. So why shale gas? Where did this come from? The best place to start with this is the OPEC oil embargo back in the 1970s. And there's a few people in this room old enough to remember that. If you went through it or you heard about it or you know about it, it was pretty disruptive. The price of gasoline quadrupled from 40 cents to $1.60 a gallon, which really doesn't sound like that much, but in today's prices, imagine $4 a gallon gasoline going up to $16 a gallon. That was the kind of pain that happened. And it's hard to overestimate how traumatic this was to both the American public and to the government. So in response to this, the government, primarily the U.S. Department of Energy, which was started in 1977, but some predecessor agencies as well, began some fossil energy research and demonstration projects in the 1980s to try to look for domestic sources of oil and gas to try to free up some of our dependence on foreign oil and oil cartels that could disrupt supply. So the new sources of natural gas, there were a number of resources that were known, but were not economical to produce. And so shale gas, I mean, the Dunkirk shale had been produced in Fredonia, New York, commercially since 1821. There was a hand-dug well in the shale in Fredonia, New York, that was supplying some commercial buildings down in the downtown area. The Huron Shale has been produced in Kentucky since the early 1900s. There's coal seam gas, there's tight sands. So the Department of Energy funded a number of natural gas research and development projects to try to, again, increase this domestic energy supply of fossil fuels. And these were the Eastern Gas Shales Project, which was actually my first job out of school, was working on that. Western Tight Gas Sands, coal bed methane, geopressured aquifers, and then some later projects looking at methane hydrates and ultra-deep gas. This paper that I've got up here by Leo Schreider and Robert Wise of DOE was published back in 1980, and it provides some interesting insight, particularly today, looking back on where this might have come from. It gives you a pretty good idea what people were thinking about back then. So the Eastern Gas Shales Project went from 76 to 92. I worked on it for about 3 years in the early 1980s. And this was a field project to look at ways to assess the shale resource and try to figure out ways to get gas out of the shale. So what's the problem? Well, shale is a fine-grained rock composed of mud. And so it's made up of clay, quartz, carbonate, and so on. It comes in two varieties. It comes in organic rich, which is black shale, and it comes in organic lean, which is gray or sometimes red shale. The black shales are the gas targets, the feeling being that the organic matter in there will create the gas, and so that's what you go after. But shale, because it's so fine-grained, it's deposited in very quiet water conditions, so the small grains give you small pores. So even though the porosity in this stuff might be about 10%, the permeability is really, really low. It's very hard for gas to move between these tiny little pores. And so that has been the problem, is how do you get gas out of this rock that's extremely tight, and it's hard for it to move. So these well locations were done all over the Appalachian Basin, Ohio, Pennsylvania, New York, West Virginia, Kentucky, Virginia, and even one down in Tennessee. There were also some shales, similar black shales in the Michigan Basin and some in the Illinois Basin that were also investigated. And so for audiences of non-geologists, I always include this slide too, the Marcellus Shale. People wonder where the name comes from. And so geologists name rocks after a location where the exposures are representative of the formation. So this is known as the type locality, and the type locality for the Marcellus Shale is near the town of Marcellus, New York. And that's the actual outcrop, picture of it, the type locality outcrop. The town was named for a famous Roman general, Marcus Claudius Marcellus, the sword of Rome, and he was famous for keeping Hannibal and the army of Carthage away from the city. Kept them busy out in the Italian countryside, and they never actually got to Rome. So the town was named after General Marcellus, and the shale is named after the town. Okay, so what happened? Well, we did a lot of study on a lot of different methods of ways to try to produce a shale that mostly involved drilling vertical wells and trying different kind of technologies to create fractures or hydraulically fracture or frack the rock. Hydraulic fracturing is really nothing more than putting water in the ground under pressure, exceeding the rock's strength, and causing a crack to form. And a lot of times what happens is you have natural fractures in the rock, and it opens those up, and it connects up with other natural fractures, and you create a network or a system. The idea is to create high permeability flow paths into the rock so that the gas, even though every square inch of rock is only going to produce a small amount of gas, if you get in contact with enough square inches with all these fractures, with enough area, you can get a reasonable return on the amount of gas. So the Eastern Gas Shales Project wells that were done with this vertical drilling and different kinds of hydraulic fracturing were pretty much hit or miss in terms of success. Well, what happened in the 1990s was a change in drilling technology and an improvement in the fracturing technology. The drilling technology changed because oil companies were getting out into deeper and deeper water in the Gulf. When you drill in shallow water, your drill tower is actually, it's a steel tower that sits on the bottom. When you get into really deep water, you go into what's called a tension leg platform. And what that is a partly submerged drilling structure that's anchored to the bottom with steel cables, and those steel cables are under tension because this thing is buoyant and it's going upward, so it keeps tension on the steel cables and it holds everything in place. Okay, those work in water that's 5,000, 6,000, 8,000 feet deep, but the problem is when you want to move them, you have to have deep diving submersibles to go down there to undo those cables and move these platforms. So it is an expensive proposition to move the platforms around, so the directional drilling, the big oil companies finally put some money behind that to develop the technology so they could drill into multiple reservoirs from a single location on the platform without having to move the platform. And directional drilling had been around since the 1930s, but it wasn't very efficient and it didn't work very well. And so finally in the 90s, you know, they got some big money behind it and they developed the technology. So the improvements that happened were downhole hydraulic motors. So you just turn the bit downhole. You don't have to rotate the whole drill string from the surface. That lets you make bends and twists in the pipe without breaking. Geosteering, so you had a much better idea of location and where the borehole was going, and telemetry back to the surface. And so they were able to develop 5,000-foot horizontal wells or laterals into the shale. The hydraulic fracturing had also developed. There was an improvement. One was a light sand frac, which uses less proppant and less sand material to hold the fractures open, and a slick water frac, which is an addition of a surfactant or a friction-reducing compound to the frac fluid that lets you go down a long borehole, long vertical borehole, and then out a long lateral without having serious friction losses that you would have if you didn't do that. So these horizontal wells with the staged hydraulic fracs end up contacting a lot more reservoir volume than vertical wells and produce economical amounts of gas. So this technology was adapted by Michel Energy in the 1990s, late 1990s, on the Barnett Shale in Texas, which you can see on the map there. Some of the other companies found out about it. It was used on the Fayetteville and the Haynesville, and then the last one to be developed, the more recent one to be developed was the Marcellus. And this has now moved on to the Bakken Shale up in North Dakota, which is a oil producer, the Eagle Ford down in Texas. They're talking about the Monterey in California and several other ones. Worldwide, there's a lot of shale gas potential. There are a lot of countries that are interested, particularly countries in Europe. Poland is very interested, so is Germany. Poland and Germany both buy a fair amount of almost all their gas from the Russians, and it's quite a bit more expensive than the price of gas in this country. And so they are looking at potential for energy independence if they can produce their own gas. Now, there is no doubt that this is an industrial process. It requires a big drill rig, and it requires a lot of equipment and a big pad to do these shale gas wells. You're drilling 7,000 feet vertically and 5,000 or 6,000 feet horizontally. That is a lot of drill pipe. That's 13,000, 14,000 feet of drill pipe. You need a big rig to handle that much. I have never seen rigs this big in the Appalachian Basin before the beginning of the Marcellus. The downhole drilling motor is shown on the upper right there. The spiral twists in the pipe or would actually turn the motor. And then on the lower right there is the setup for hydraulic fracturing. They put those big massive wellheads on to control pressure when they do the hydraulic frac. Hydraulic fracturing operations are impressive, and this is another big industrial process. You've got a lot of equipment. You've got a lot of trucks out there. The water supply is actually in a pond behind me from where I was taking this picture, but down below on the pad, in the middle there, all that sort of spaghetti tangle of tubing and pipes is where they mix everything together. There's a blender truck off to the right, and then the pump trucks, the cloud of diesel smoke, there's a row of pump trucks there on the right that are building up pressure. They use like a piston pump to pressurize the stuff up. The two guys in the background are standing on top of the sand truck, and the sand is mixed in as the proppant to hold the fracture open after they release the pressure. So there have been some assertions that have about hydraulic fracturing and about shale gas that have alarmed a lot of people. And these are some papers that have been published in the last couple of years that if you've looked into this issue at all, you'd be familiar with these. But when you look at the actual data on the risks, the risks stated in these papers are largely overstated, I think. One thing I also want to point out is there's a lot of concern in the popular literature about out-of-zone fractures, about hydraulic fracturing coming up from below and contaminated drinking water. That has only been recorded possibly in one instance in Pavilion, Wyoming. There hasn't really been any other record of that happening. And if you look at the actual heights of the fracs and the depths of the fresh water, there's quite a bit of separation. This is a paper that was published last year, a couple of years ago, on Marcellus. The one for the Barnett looks similar. And the biggest concern about groundwater contamination is more from surface spills, surface activities, than fracs coming up from below. So what are the real risks? Well, risk assessment is looking at two things. Engineering risk, which is potential for contaminant release or an induced seismic event, a man-made earthquake, that's related to the actual well construction and production process. The second thing we're looking at is what's called cumulative risk, which is the impact of these wells on a landscape or in a watershed. As you start adding wells, as you start adding more and more pads, as you develop a resource, you accumulate each one of those introduces a small amount of risk, but you accumulate the risk as you keep adding to that. And so the question is, what's the limit? Where do we exceed some kind of a threshold? Where do we have to say this is enough? We can't have any more in this watershed or we're going to have detrimental effects. The receptors of risk are air, water, landscapes, and ecosystems, and I include human health and ecosystems. And we're looking at ways to reduce risk through regulations and enforcement. When you start looking at the data, you discover that most of the risk is introduced by human error, that the engineering processes themselves are pretty well figured out. It's when people don't follow the engineering processes that you have problems, and that is a regulatory issue and an enforcement issue. All right, so we've got a multi-agency assessment going on right now. Last year, President Obama directed that the Department of Energy, the Environmental Protection Agency, and the U.S. Geological Survey work together on this. We were all sort of working independently and kind of collaborating, but not enough for Washington's desire. So we spent most of last summer, pulling together a comprehensive national plan on ways that the three agencies would cooperate, along with some other. We had the Corps of Engineers involved a little bit, and the Centers for Disease Control and some other agencies involved in how we were going to assess the risks and receptors. And we decided to focus on the Marcellus, the Barnett, and the Bakken shales because those three have a fair amount of data. So this plan was completed in November and sent to the White House for review, and we're still waiting to hear back. But the risk assessment, our part of the risk assessment is looking at the actual production itself on the well sites. So we're looking at air emissions, we're looking at produced water management, subsurface migration of gas and fluids, and induced seismicity. And our program uses field data, lab data, and computer modeling to try to do this assessment. All right, I'll just skip through this just briefly. This integrated risk assessment is actually being done by DOE, and there's a number of 5 national labs that are doing risk assessment in terms of carbon dioxide storage in geologic reservoirs. So if you want to sequester CO2, you can put it into a depleted oil and gas reservoir, but you have to look at the risk of how well is it going to stay there? Is it going to migrate up? So there's a whole process involved for doing this integrated risk assessment, which basically breaks down the process into individual components, assesses the risk of each component, and then integrates them together into a site performance assessment. We are in the process of adapting and modifying this for unconventional oil and gas. It's turning out not to be quite as straightforward as we'd hoped because they are really different, but this is the route we're going. Okay, so to sum up, our goals in this are to assess short-term, long-term, and cumulative environmental impacts, try to define the engineering risks, and produce a database scientific investigation of the impacts and processes. The outcomes that we are hoping for is a rigorous study with conclusions supported by well-documented data, and the benefits then are information-based regulations, improved management practices, and a more informed environmental debate. Thank you.
Our next speaker is Fred Baldassari.
Thank you, Michelle. Good afternoon, everybody. Today I'm going to talk a little bit about some research myself and two colleagues that I want to acknowledge real quickly, Dr. Mark McCaffrey with Weatherford Laboratories and Dr. John Harper, formerly with the Pennsylvania Geological Survey. So the title, first I'm going to talk about a little bit of baseline about gas migration, which stray gas migration has been tasked as the biggest environmental concern by the oil and gas program in Pennsylvania. So many of you may have seen Gasland, the issue with people lighting their water on fire. That can be a consequence of gas migrating in the subsurface. Some of that may be the result of gas well drilling, but what you'll see is it's been around for a long time and it's not always exclusive to the gas well drilling industry. When we're in the Marcellus region, in the Appalachian Basin, it's a petroliferous basin. So we have organic matter with petroleum products. It's not unusual to have methane as a natural condition in the groundwater system. That's actually not unusual to have it. And so we do have stray gas problems. It can be natural. It can be the result of legacy problems. In Pennsylvania, where most of my work is, we have a lot of legacy wells, shallow wells. Since the 1800s, they've been drilling oil and gas wells in the Commonwealth. Prior to modern standards, they weren't abandoned properly. And recent activity. So all of these things are potential sources for gas migration. So there's no silver bullet. We have to support our investigations by multiple lines of evidence approach, just basic scientific principles. With stray gas incidents, they can manifest in a couple of different ways, either non-threatening. You have a little bit of gas dissolved in water at low concentrations. It's really not a threat. But at higher concentrations above the solubility, it can escalate to a potentially threatening situation and can be threatening or catastrophic. So these are all, what you're going to see now, these are all the results of stray gas migration when we don't pay attention to what happened. In the first case I investigated in western Pennsylvania, it was actually the result, the investigation revealed was actually the result of a natural condition in the groundwater. The homeowner knew he had gas in his water supply. There was no anthropogenic influence. He had a yield problem with his well. The drillers came in, went to drill the well deeper. Nobody informed the other person. There was an explosion, killed the homeowner, and killed one of the drillers. The next image here is the result of a pipeline leak. and that also killed the occupant of a structure. So these are all stray gas problems, stray gas migration. The lower left is the result of, this was the most catastrophic one I was involved in. It was an operating gas well that caused this explosion. It killed 3 people, including a 19-month-old child. And it was an operating gas well that caused this problem. And then in Greene County in the early 90s, we had a gas migration problem that was the result of underground coal mining, where they reduced the hydrostatic head in the overlying aquifer and caused the gas to come out of solution and move into a water supply well. So all of these incidents predate any kind of contemporary shale gas development, but there's been a lot of focus recently on gas migration and the industry being tasked with it. And as a result of that, there were new regulations established in 2011 in Pennsylvania that actually address that. We'll get into that in a minute. So what do we mean by gas migration? The reason why it's an issue. So, basic physics, gas wants to move from areas of high pressure to low pressure. Homes, basements, anytime you couple a structure with the soils, and anytime you drill a hole in the ground like a water well, that represents a low pressure zone. So those are natural migration receptors for gas to migrate towards. This is just a little cartoon to illustrate that, with Henry's law, we know that, so methane is soluble in water at 28 milligrams per liter, but with increasing hydrostatic head, you can squeeze more methane into the water, and hence the images that you see where people can light their water on fire. So here's just a little hypothetical example. If we have a water well, and at the bottom of this well, we have a pump at the very bottom. Most of the water wells that are constructed have submersible pumps. We have a water well that's pumping from this depth here. We have 200 feet ahead, theoretically. So we can squeeze at 1 atmosphere. We're at 1 atmosphere here, and at the bottom of 200 feet, you're almost 6 atmospheres of pressure. At the top, the most you can put in there is 28 milligrams per liter. So if we pour a glass of water, the most that will stay in that water dissolved is 28 milligrams per liter. But at depth, in this scenario here, we can squeeze as much as 193 milligrams per liter of methane into the water. And as we pump that up to the surface, we go from 6 atmospheres of pressure to 1 atmosphere of pressure, and we can release almost 163 milligrams per liter. Now that's theoretically, if you're above the saturation, that's how much you can have in it. So hence the lighting the faucets on fire and those kind of images that you may have seen. If we have, the experience that we've had is if we have gas migration that's the result of gas well drilling activity, as Dan pointed out, there's not been one case where hydraulic fracturing was the mechanism to cause a stray gas problem. Even though there's been suggestion in some of the literature that that is the cause, it's not been the cause. It's typically cement and casing, bad cement or casing. In these situations, you have these non-commercial zones. If you don't get a good cement job, where you have to cement your casing into the ground and get a good cement job, this creates a pathway for that gas to move up along the annular space and into these other permeable formations and eventually up into the water table and potentially even into the soils as a free gas. So the gas, depending on how much gas we're dealing with, that's the primary mechanism that we see is poor or ineffective cement. I'm not going to read through these. In 2011, new regulations were promulgated in Pennsylvania. I worked under John Hanger, who was our secretary, and helped write these new regulations for gas migration response. So Pennsylvania has probably the strictest and maybe one of the only regulations in the United States on gas migration response. If a complainant calls the DEP or calls an operator and says, we think we have gas in our water well, the operator is required to do a full-blown investigation. And there are different thresholds for that investigation. As you know, when we talk about stray gas, I'll just remind everybody, it is methane. It's primarily methane. Methane is what we're dealing with primarily. And its explosion, it's an asphyxiation or explosion hazard. and it's explosive in an atmosphere like this at 5 to 15%. So if it were to accumulate in this building at 5 to 15% and there was an ignition source, we would have an explosion. So the threshold for an investigation is much lower than that. At 0.5%, if we go in a structure and we find that, then that requires an emergency response type of response to the levels. And then these are the other concentrations that are in, these are right out of the regulations. In the atmosphere at these concentrations, greater than 1% or of the LEL, which is 0.05%, and less than 10% of the LEL, which is 0.5% gas. And then if we find gas in the water well headspace at 1.25% or 25% of the LEL, and then in the soils, there's no number attached to it, but we propose 500 parts per million. And then the last number is a very low threshold. So conceivably, the way this works is an operator typically takes a baseline groundwater sample before they drill in an area. They'll sample somebody's private water supply well, and if it's non-detect for methane, and then there's a complaint, and those results post-complaint reveal 7 milligrams per liter or greater, they're required to do an investigation, the operator is. And that's a very low threshold, because actually between non-detect and 7 oftentimes is within variability of normal ranges in the groundwater system. As you saw, the hydrostatic head differences alone can account for significant changes in the groundwater. The way we constrain the origin of gas, and this is what our research is looking at isotope geochemistry. So we look at the stable isotopes of carbon and hydrogen on methane, carbon and CH4, methane CH4. Those stable isotopes are relative to the processes that create methane. There's two pathways. Microbial methane actually has a number of different pathways, but there are two primary pathways. There's CO2 reduction, and then there's fermentation, and you create microbial gas from that. And it has a unique isotope composition, which is different from natural gases from coal bed or from producing formations. So by using isotopes, we can constrain the origin of the gas. The other pathway is this thermogenic pathway, which is, thermogenic just means heat and pressure. So if you look on the Y scale here, as we go deeper, we're getting more heat and pressure early on in the system as the materials are buried, and we have the precursors for oil and gas. We start generating what's called biogenic or microbial methane and early thermogenic gas. And then with more heat and pressure, as we get deeper, we go into what's called the oil window, and we start creating higher hydrocarbons with oil and gas. And then as we get deeper, we get more methane and less oil, and you start seeing C2, ethane, propane, butane, those kind of compounds. And that's what gas produced from the Marcellus in southwestern PA looks like. When we get into northeast, north central PA, it looks very different. More heat and pressure, a different paleo environment, and things are cooked off, and so we only have primarily methane, a little bit of ethane, and it's what we call a post-mature gas. So here, on to our research, real quick. What we did was we tried to determine what was the origin of these gases that occur naturally in the subsurface, and we wanted to use 3 different data types to determine that. We look at the molecular and isotope composition for gas wells that are drilled into the Marcellus. We look at historical evidence in the geologic survey, and we look at pre-drill baseline groundwater sample results. This is our 5-county study area in northeast, north central PA. This is the stratigraphy for that area, and you see at the base of that is the Marcellus formation. And we actually sampled, it's the largest database in the Appalachian Basin for isotope data, over 2,200 sample points from 234 Marcellus wells. And so here's some of the cross sections. I'm sorry, I have to go through this really quickly. Here are some of the cross sections and what you'll see in AA prime. So that's the southern part here. And if we look at a cross section here, you can see as a natural condition up into the Catskill area, we find gas shows. And we have multiple gas shows here in the aquifer system. That's a natural condition, and it's a thermogenic gas. It didn't get there because it migrated from a gas well or from any kind of anthropogenic influence. It's there as a natural condition, and the same in the other formations as well. B prime cross-section, which is a little bit north of our AA prime, same kind of scenario. Lots of gas shows. We typed those gas shows with isotope data, and it's the gas that occurs in this aquifer system up here is very different from what we see at depth in the Marcellus. And I won't get into the partial isotope reversals, but it's a way that we can uniquely categorize the deeper type of gases. This is a plot of our data. On the y-axis is the isotopes of hydrogen. On the x-axis is the hydrogen or the methane carbon isotopes. And these regions are based on worldwide data sets. So microbial gas that's produced this pathway, falls in this region generally, and the fermentation pathway, and then thermogenic gas. And these are our different gases. And what we see here, the Marcellus and the Tully and these other deep formations are over here. The Lock Haven and the Catskill data plot over in this area. Same thing when we look at ethane to methane. Very unique. This gas is very unique compared to these gases here. And these are all from different formations. This is just another plot looking at the hydrocarbon ratios versus the carbon isotopes and the different maturity levels. And this is just an example of, so if you look at this, we're drilling the well. As we drill the well, we encounter these gases, we fingerprint them, and then we cross over into a seal. This is actually the horizontal portion of the well at this depth, and these are all different gases. You can see this is different. The ethane isotope is actually lighter than the methane isotope, and that's reverse up here. And this is just another example. And more data. This is what we call a normal thermal maturation trend in this area. And this data, research data, corroborated what we found in the geologic survey in terms of looking at well records and completion reports. We didn't have isotope data, but they did acknowledge gas shows up in here as a natural condition from wells that date back to the 1930s, and some even a little bit earlier. Also water supply wells, that background baseline conditions also show natural conditions of thermogenic methane in the groundwater that's there as a natural condition. It has nothing to do with migration. I'm not going to read through this, but this paper hopefully will be published in AAPG this summer. It's been submitted. We've gone through one peer review. And the point of bringing this up is it's been identified in Pennsylvania as the biggest environmental concern by the head of the oil and gas program. The industry has made a lot of progress in terms of engineering practices. Dan pointed out too that the way that they drill wells now has changed dramatically since 2008 to 2012. Cementing is better, casing is better, the drilling technique is better. They've gotten a lot better at doing this thing. And that's it. I love this slide. This is in Western PA. And somehow that's a metaphor for life, I think. Do you go to paradise and stop? And if you keep going, you might get in trouble, I guess. Anyway, thank you very much.
I'm going to be talking about the environmental issues and the myriad environmental issues that we face here today. And you often hear, oh well, that problem is the elephant sitting in the middle of the room. Well, with gas development, when you really look at what's happening, where it's occurring, particularly shale gas development, we feel there's a whole room full of elephants that are being ignored. And many key issues are going unaddressed. And I'm going to go through them. A lot of them are related to lack of regulation, but there's other issues as well. We really pretty much see a triple play of problems. Number one, we have poor performance and government oversight. And this seems to be endemic throughout a lot of our extraction industries today, but particularly in shale gas, which came on the scene so quickly and moved ahead in such a, in such a rush. Second of all, we have inadequate regulations, and I'll explain what I mean by that. And third of all, we have unmet technical and environmental challenges. First of all, poor performance and government oversight. Now, I'd just like to look at some statistics in order to be able to illustrate the problem in Pennsylvania as an example. In 2012, there were 9 violations of environmental permits by drillers per day. That's a lot of violations. Every inspection had at least 1 violation, and most of them had 2. Only about 1/3 of those violations resulted in enforcements. And the rate of development was about 6.5 wells being drilled per day. And about half of those were actually inspected. Now remember, there are already about 25,000 wells in Pennsylvania that are operating. So the inspections need to be ongoing for wells that are existing as well. And all the inspections that were done here were about half of those wells. So far in 2013, it's pretty much the same. The drilling pace has cut back to 5.43 per day. That has a lot to do with the price of gas. But still, the violations are up there, 5.43, and there is at least 1 violation for every inspection. It turns out a lot of the reason for that is the way DEP counts them now. If you have a series of violations when they visit the site, they count it as 1. So it's not necessarily a better performance indicator here. And we have 5.43, as I said, wells per day, and about half of those were inspected. So we're not doing very well. And because of the low rate of enforcements when violations are found, violators are continuing to operate at will. And what happens when you have a bad actor is he pays the small fine, or he says, I'll fix it quickly, and he doesn't even get fined, and he goes on with business as usual. Now, these pictures are a series of photographs that were taken at a site where there was a frac fluid spill, hydraulic fracturing fluid spill. And this was by a Cabot, a driller, in Dimmock, Pennsylvania, in Susquehanna County in northeastern PA. And it's an example in real-world fracking of that problem that we were talking about, of having poor oversight and poor performance, and it's also poor regulation. The National Academy of Sciences has recently issued a follow-up of a report on a study that's ongoing, and they looked at 283 water quality observations in Pennsylvania having to do with the gas development between 2000 and 2011. When the well pads increase, they found, when you get to a high density, particularly in this case up to 18 wells on a pad, the total dissolved solids increased by 5% in the receiving waterway. So there is a direct impact to the waterway where you have dense development of wells. They also found that 1 upstream wastewater plant that accepts and releases frac wastewater increases chlorides by 7% in that stream. Now, these percentages degrade water quality and habitat, and the cumulative impact of multiple discharges can lead to ecosystem and water quality destruction. Now, in this instance here, poor regulation also led to the problem that is illustrated here. First of all, when the emergency responders came to the site, they didn't know what this stuff was. And they didn't know if they even had the proper equipment on when they got to the site. And somebody ran up to the trailer, got the MSDS sheet and looked at it, and it said, well, it was a possible carcinogen. Well, they didn't have any more direct information about what was in this formula, and it was a trade secret that's protected by Halliburton, who was doing the frac job. And so they really didn't know how toxic it was. As a result, they did put a boom in, and they did clean it up, but they left a lot of the material in the wetlands, and there was a fish kill as a result in Stevens Creek downstream. Now, if they had known exactly what was in that, if they'd known the percentage, for instance, of one of the constituents that obviously had a deadly impact on fish in the stream, then they could have made a faster effort and a more complete effort in getting that pollutant out of the stream, and maybe they could have avoided that fish kill. Maybe they would have removed the material they left sitting in the wetlands, which is there to this day, slowly migrating into that waterway. So this is a problem with the poor regulation because of what's been dubbed the Halliburton loophole, which is an exemption from the Safe Drinking Water Act, where they would have to disclose all of these ingredients. And I'll talk a little bit more about that in a second. It's also an example of poor performance on the part of the operator. And that's because it was a coupling that came loose and no one noticed it. And that's how the fluid got onto the ground. They were getting ready to inject it into the well. And then also there was no secondary containment in place, which is a poor regulation problem. But In terms of operator problems, they did not have an up-to-date plan, which they're required to do under their drilling permit, of how to deal with these problems and prevent them on site. It's the safety plan that's required for every site. They did not have an up-to-date one. So they really weren't in a good position in order to deal with this problem. And this happens over and over and over again, as the statistics can tell about the violations in Pennsylvania. Now, inadequate regulations for gas wells and infrastructure, the second problem. Now, we have a lot of, I'm going to run through a few different impacts here. The first one, surface impacts. Soil, vegetation, and ecosystem destruction comes along with the development of wells and also their infrastructure, in this picture here, a gas pipeline. Also, we have habitat loss. We have surface water pollution, mentioned that Academy of Sciences study. There are other studies as well. And we have water resource degradation and conversion to basically industrial landscapes of what is presently, where most of these wells are going in, forested. The majority of the land is forested, according to a Nature Conservancy report. And farmland, agricultural areas, largely rural areas. So it's converting those natural landscapes into industrial landscapes. Now, the federal exemption from the Clean Water Act allows them to ignore the stormwater provisions that other industries and for instance, domestic residential development has to follow. They only have to go so far in dealing with the erosion and sedimentation controls. And because of that loophole that was granted to them in the Clean Water Act by the 2005 Energy Policy Act passage during the Bush administration, because of that loophole, they do not have to come up with as complete a plan as you would if you were another industry or developing the land for a housing development, for instance. You don't have to have a permanent stormwater plan. You don't have to measure things in the same way. You don't have to keep the same distances from waterways. So there are loopholes and relaxation as a result of the Federal Clean Water Act stormwater exemption. Also, one of the problems posed by the lack of adequate regulations is that of a lack of required monitoring. Under the stormwater regulations that were put in place in the Clean Water Act, you have to monitor and find out what's going on, what's on the site before you go there, what's going on while you're developing, and then you have to have a plan to deal with any changed conditions to the land so you prevent degradation of streams, wetlands, and the natural soils. You don't have to do that under the Clean Water Act exemption. And you could guess that that might be by design, because it certainly makes it go a lot faster. And also, because of the dearth of data, it's very hard then to lay the blame on the operator if you don't know what your baseline is before you got in there. So you don't know what you have until it's gone. And I'd just like to remind you going way back to John Locke, the absence of evidence is not evidence of absence, but that is pretty much the way that the industry is operating today, by the lack of monitoring that is required. Now, there's some voluntary, but what's required generally in shale gas development is practically nil. Now, another one of these exemptions is from the Safe Drinking Water Act. I mentioned that earlier. It's also dubbed the Halliburton loophole. And as a result of the Safe Drinking Water Act, we are experiencing increased groundwater and aquifer pollution that we would not have to be experiencing if that exemption were not there. We're also experiencing water depletion and disruption of the hydrologic cycle, and that's mainly due to inadequate state, regional, and federal withdrawal regulations, inadequate stream flow protections that would protect ecological flow and habitats in the stream, and inadequate water conservation regulations. Failures in the integrity of well casings, we heard talked about the expert here, Fred, right before me, and they do occur regularly. The scientific literature talks about these occurrences, and industry literature confirms that there's about a 6% failure rate in young wells in the first 5 years, in the casings and the cement casings and steel casings that are put in when they drill a well. And as a result of that percent, early on, you also then, in order to get a handle on what the full impact will be over time, you need to look at how long does that cement last? How long do those casings last? Our hydrogeologist has looked at the literature, and I have some handouts here, and has made it very clear that within 80 to 100 years, you will have disintegration of the competency of that wellbore, which actually is the only thing that's protecting the aquifer that the wellbore travels through from pollutants within the wellbore, gases, light, non-aqueous phase liquids, and other fluids that will migrate up as produced water. And those can migrate into the aquifer as those barriers break down over time. As a matter of fact, our hydrogeologist, Paul Rubin, points out that within 100 years, it is virtually certain that aquifers will be polluted by these wells because the cement and the casings that are being put in are simply not able to withstand longer than 100 years the harsh downhole conditions that exist. And no matter what the pathway of pollution is, there are other sources of it as well. Drill cuttings, for instance. Drill cuttings can occur in terms of pollution in three basic ways. One of them is pressurized injection outwards during drilling, which then can disperse upwards into contact with the surface and with groundwater. Secondly, downward infiltration beneath unlined landfills, because it is perfectly legal to store these drill cuttings above ground in open pits. And then also the third is on-site burial of drill cuttings. It is legal in Pennsylvania, for instance, to bury this waste on-site where the well is drilled. This is an example I want to give here that our hydrogeologist is working on right now for us. And it's a real-world example of this problem that we have of groundwater pollution in Pennsylvania impacted by drilling and fracking. And the slide on the left shows the groundwater endemic pH pre-drilling. And then afterwards it shows the pH post-fracking. Now, we had information, we had data in this particular instance because there had been baseline data that was collected by the homeowner, and then also because there were problems there and violations issued by DEP, there was more data that has been gathered over time and also private lawsuits brought. But this data is being crunched, and we're looking at the drill cuttings, and we're looking at the water chemistry of the homeowners' wells in that area. And it's showing that there is actually changes to the chemistry of the water. Now, water and air pollution, ground and surface water contamination from toxins and chemical hazards are a direct result of other federal exemptions. The federal exemptions from the Resource Conservation and Recovery Act, Subtitle C, the Comprehensive Environmental Response Compensation and Liability Act, also known as the Superfund Law, and the Community Right to Know Act, and its Toxic Resource Inventory, which is a part of that legislation, they're also exempt from, and also from portions of the Clean Air Act, and also because of lax state standards. And as a result of these, and we can talk more about it because time is limited, but as a result of these exemptions, we are experiencing pollution that we would not be experiencing if they were not given out. So, believe it or not, even though there are hazardous materials such as benzene, toluene, there are brines, heavy salts, radioactive materials, naturally occurring radioactive materials, and metals that are toxic. Even though these hazardous materials are in the waste that is produced, it is not treated as if it were hazardous. Because of the magic exemption from the Resource Conservation and Recovery Act, these materials can actually be handled by facilities that are not hazardous waste facilities. So that means that what has been happening with a lot of this waste has been diluted and put into our waterways, or it also has been injected into deep wells. But the result is pollution that we would not be experiencing if there were not these exemptions. I'd like to also, the third point, in the short time I have left, are unmet technical environmental challenges. The GAO, the General Accountability Office of the United States, has made it very clear in their analysis that shale gas wastewater is toxic. It contains hazardous pollutants, and it poses substantial management and disposal challenges. And that's because of what I mentioned before, the very high concentration of salts, the metals, the hydrocarbons, and exposure to these is dangerous and has harmful human health impacts. We know that many of these materials are carcinogenic, for instance. And the handling of this wastewater is one of those elephants in the middle of the room, because there are not even basic federal minimum standards for the safe treatment through pretreatment of frack wastewater at the federal level. So because of that, there's none at the state levels. And this wastewater at this point in time is really not being, the challenges presented by this wastewater is not being met by the industry, and it's not being met by the regulators, because they're simply not equipped to do it. One of the big problems is radioactive materials. And radium-226 is the most long-lived of these. A half-life of 1,600 years is very high in Marcellus Shale. It's higher in Marcellus Shale than any other Barnett Shale, for instance. And that material actually kicks off Geiger counters when it goes to a facility, a landfill facility, for instance, that is equipped to test these materials. But it also has come here to New Jersey, and that's why New Jersey legislature voted a ban in place, and that's why they've also passed a wastewater ban, even though the governor of New Jersey has overridden those through vetoes. But the legislature saw that we needed to do something about this, but that waste actually came to New Jersey. I managed through open records request to track down where it went to, and it went to a place called Clean Earth and in Kearney, and they took material that was radioactive above what they're allowed to take, because they're simply a solid waste facility, and it was only caught, because they do not have Geiger counters, by an inspector who saw a funny looking roll-off and took a sample and found out that they were exceeding, and for months were accepting and processing at a facility not equipped to treat radioactive material, radioactive drill cuttings from Pennsylvania. So these are the problems that we face, and they're really rooted in the fact that this industry, and this is the Marcellus Shale in New York, this industry is not playing on the same field as all other industries, and because of subsidies from the federal government and these loopholes, they are passing on, or they're externalizing many of the costs to us as taxpayers and future generations. And until that happens, my organization believes that at this point, we need a moratorium on shale gas drilling. We need a moratorium not only in the Delaware River watershed, where we have it right now, not only in New York, where it is in place temporarily anyway, but we need a national moratorium in order to deal with these serious environmental problems, because there is no way when it comes to shale gas. These materials, and we can talk more about it as we go ahead, these materials and the development of shale gas is also contributing, because it's a fossil fuel, to global climate change. And at a time when we're on the cusp and we're reaching a tipping point, we simply cannot afford to continue down a path of developing natural gas, which is one of the major greenhouse gases, and there's some statistics here. Utica Shale, by the way, is in New Jersey, so a ban on drilling in New Jersey is not just an academic exercise. It actually would make some sense. And there are other shales in the Newark Basin that are gas-bearing, according to the USGS. This is the Delaware River. I want to end with that, and thank you very much. We'll go to questions and answers.